Scientists are currently using gene therapy to try and create a microorganism capable of breaking down plutonium, but they have not yet had any success.
The plutonium version of bioremediation, huh? Instead of processing, what about reusing it? I thought that they were working on using dismantled plutonium for civilian applications.
For a time, it looked like there was going to be international cooperation for that. But unfortunately, there was too much mutual suspicion and it all fell apart.
Otacon said that now it's possible to design and test new types of nuclear weapons in a virtual simulation without ever exploding a nuclear device. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. Since the establishment of DART and NEEF early in the 21st century, there has been a wealth of data concerning nuclear fission and fusion. There is also much data accumulated from the nuclear tests conducted over the last 4 decades. With the processing speed of today's supercomputers, they can design a new nuclear weapon through virtual reality computer simulations. In order to collect data for the simulation experiments, they are doing subcritical tests underground. Those are experiments in which they detonate high explosives in proximity to plutonium without setting off a critical chain reaction. They then measure the effect that the shockwave has on the plutonium. By measuring the particles which fly off the surface of the plutonium, they can learn the mass, speed, and distribution of the plutonium particles. The politicians insist that whether it is above ground or below ground, a nuclear test which does not cause a nuclear explosion is not a nuclear test, and therefore does not violate the CTBT. A lot of people do not agree with that interpretation. The first subcritical test was performed on July 2nd, 1997, at the Nevada Nuclear Testing Facility. After that, subcritical testing became extremely common, not only in America, but in Russia countries too. They say that the reason for the tests is to ensure the safety and reliability of the existing nuclear stockpile, but that is nothing more than a flimsy cover story. In reality, the danger of a nuclear weapon exploding accidentally decreases over time. It is clear that the real reason for these tests is to aid in the development of new types of nuclear weapons. Even the government admits that the data collected from those tests is used in virtual reality simulation tests. They were conducting exercises with this new Metal Gear prototype? Is that what the DARPA chief said?
Yeah.
What the hell?
So you know about Metal Gear?
Just rumors. I heard it is some kind of walking tank that can deliver an accurate nuclear strike from any terrain. Mountains, deserts, swamps, wherever. But you are the real expert on Metal Gear, aren't you, Snake?
Yeah, I guess I am. But what about the PAL system that the DARPA chief mentioned?
It is a device attached to a nuclear weapon system to prevent the missile from being armed or launched. Usually, a secret detonation code or combination is necessary to launch the missile.
According to the chief, there are 2 codes, and the terrorists already know one of them.
The other code? If the terrorists find out that one too.
Yeah, I've got to hurry and rescue President Baker.
When Dr. Emmerich designed a new Metal Gear prototype, he thought he was creating a mobile TMD system. He is a very naive man. TMD stands for Theater Missile Defense. They represent a shift in defense priorities from dealing with the threat of ICBMs from the former Soviet Union to dealing with small-scale regional conflicts in the Third World. Current TMD systems work by a combination of THAADs, Theater High Altitude Air Defense, which intercept missiles outside of the atmosphere, and Patriot-type missiles, which intercept missiles within the atmosphere. Dr. Emmerich was planning on them using Metal Gear as a low-atmosphere, mobile missile interceptor unit. There are many in Russia, as well as America, who are opposed to TMD systems because they say that it undermines the spirit of the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And there are also those who say that the ABM Treaty is a dinosaur left over from the Cold War. They argue that the strategy of MAD should be maintained by limiting missile defense systems. There was a big debate over it, but ultimately, under pressure from the defense industry, who is looking to expand into new markets, TMD systems were accepted as an integral part of a modern military arsenal. The development of Metal Gear is a cynical attempt to consolidate and increase our military dominance while at the same time maintaining the pretense of disarming ourselves. Now that the SLCM-0 option, allowing for the sneak inspections of submarines in international waters, has been concluded, the value of submarines as strategic weapons has been greatly diminished. With Metal Gear, governments of the world will be able to avoid this type of inspection and at the same time stay in compliance with international nuclear treaties. That is amazing. Dr. Emmerich's father participated in the Manhattan Project? That was the secret World War II project responsible for the creation of the first atomic bomb. It had a huge budget, something like $2 billion. They brought in 120,000 of the best and brightest scientists and engineers to work on it. And we all know how that story ended. In July of 1945, they exploded the first nuclear device at Trinity, followed shortly after by Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Trinity. The world was changed forever that day. Scientists and researchers could no longer pretend that their hands were clean of blood. Afterwards, the leader of the Manhattan Project, J. Robert Oppenheimer, said, "The physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." The theory of nuclear deterrence was born during the Cold War, at a time of great suspicion between the U.S. and the USSR. The great gulf between the ideologies of East and West caused a dramatic escalation in the arms race. And this escalation of the arms race in turn fueled mutual distrust and fear between the world's two great superpowers. The last half of the 20th century was shaped by the policy of nuclear deterrence. But the world has changed. The Cold War has ended, and we are now living in a world where small regional conflicts are breaking out all over. Things are not so simple anymore, and the policy of nuclear deterrence is obsolete. Most of these regional conflicts are the result of age-old enmities between different ethnic groups and religions. In those cases, the hatred often runs so deep that rationality is thrown out the window. For people such as them, the fear of a counterstrike often means little, and that is why the nuclear deterrence policy has lost much of its efficacy. A nuclear standoff is not a sufficient deterrent in the current world climate. There is no doubt about it. After the Cold War ended, the chance of a full-scale, worldwide nuclear conflagration was diminished. But on the other hand, the chances of local tactical use of nuclear weapons greatly increased. Civil wars, revolutions, regional disputes. It seems like there is a new war popping up somewhere every day. And many of them are the result of centuries-old hatred between different ethnic or religious groups. These people do not think rationally or logically. In such conflicts, there is no concern for the high civilian casualty rate, and international criticism means little. A nuclear deterrent is meaningless because emotions run so hot. Furthermore, unlike strategic nuclear missiles, the decision to use tactical nuclear missiles is in some cases left up to battlefield commanders. It is pretty scary. As long as nuclear weapons continue to proliferate, the chances that someone is going to use them will also continue to grow. In the 20th century, in order to be a military superpower, you had to first be an economic superpower. But things changed toward the end of the century after the collapse of communism. With all the surplus weapons and technology floating around, even economically weak countries could have a powerful military. America and Russia are not the only countries with nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, the UK, France, and China publicly declared the existence of their own nuclear arsenals. Since we entered the 21st century, we have confirmed the existence of nuclear weapons programs in countries throughout Africa, the Middle East, South America, and Asia. Nukes are steadily proliferating. The 21st century is paying for the 20th century's failure to plug the holes in the NPT and for the IAEA's failure to tighten nuclear control measures. The IAEA was established in 1957 to oversee peaceful as well as military applications of atomic power. But the IAEA can only investigate those countries which request an investigation. Furthermore, the timing of the inspection must be approved by the country in question. They are not allowed to do sneak inspections. The country that is being investigated can even dictate the nationality of the inspectors that they will allow in. In the late 1970s, Iraq would only allow inspectors from Bulgaria and Russia to enter the country. The IAEA does not even have the authority to level fines against countries who have committed infractions. After the Gulf War, they discovered that Iraq had been developing nuclear weapons in secret right under the investigators' noses. Unfortunately, as an organization, the IAEA just did not have the teeth to effectively stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons and technology. In 1970, all 5 nuclear powers, America, the Soviet Union, France, England, and China, signed the NPT. The treaty provided that the non-nuclear equipped countries could receive assistance for peaceful applications of nuclear power. But military applications of nuclear power were strictly prohibited, and the IAEA was given the responsibility of investigating countries who were suspected of being in non-compliance with the NPT. But the IAEA could not stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons either. Not only couldn't the IAEA levy any penalties against violating nations, but it became impossible to distinguish between technologies which would lead to military development and technologies which were for civilian applications. The right-wingers believe that as long as any country has nuclear weapons, they must have them as well. That is why they will never be in favor of the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And with each new country that acquires nuclear capabilities, the need for maintaining the counter-strike threat increases. As long as the nuclear deterrent policy continues, we will never be rid of nuclear weapons. They say that there are 500,000 nuclear engineers in the world. But after the end of the Cold War, the demand for nuclear engineers dropped precipitously. In the Eastern Bloc countries in particular, there is a tremendous brain drain. They cannot keep their scientists in the country. And each year, more and more nuclear engineers go to work for the highest bidder. Russia could no longer pay enough money to its leading scientists, so they sold their weapons and weapons technology to the highest bidders. NBC weapons flowed into the hands of dictators and terrorists. The military balance of the world crumbled. The world has never seen the balance of power shift so quickly and dramatically. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the nuclear management program fell to pieces. In the late 1990s, there were rumors that nearly 100 suitcase-sized nuclear bombs mysteriously disappeared from the Soviet arsenal. We still do not know whether it is true or not, but it is possible that they fell into the hands of terrorists. After the START II Accord was signed on January 3, 1993, Russia and the U.S. reduced their strategic nuclear warheads to between 3,000 and 3,500 warheads each. They completely dismantled all of the ICBMs which contained MIRVs. As a result of that, there are over 15,000 dismantled nuclear warheads waiting to be disposed of. Negotiations for START III began in the late 1990s. The Russian president had actually been pushing for a much more ambitious arms reduction pact, but it was rejected by the Americans. America was the sole remaining superpower on the earth, and they were not too eager to give up the title. The fact is, in the history of the world, no dominant power has ever willingly given up the reins of that power. In the case of the U.S., that means nuclear superiority. The signing of the START III was dependent on ratification of the START II, but MIRVs were the most important weapon in Russian arsenal. Naturally, the conservatives in the Russian parliament were greatly opposed to disarming them. The expansion of NATO, along with tension caused by disagreements over the application of the ABM Treaty with regards to TMD systems, made ratification in the 1990s difficult. It took a tremendous amount of pressure and secret negotiations to get the Russians to sign the START III tomorrow. But the political situation in Russia is tenuous at best, and one small incident could bring the signing to a crashing halt. If the Russians learn that America has secretly developed a new type of nuclear weapon, there is no telling how they might react. World opinion will be strongly against us too. That liquid snake is a smart one. He knows the political climate. His actions were obviously very well calculated. It is true that the signing of START 3 would mean a reduction in nuclear missiles, but it would still leave between 4,000 to 5,000 missiles between the US and Russia alone. That is more than enough to destroy every living thing on this planet several times over. There is a big difference between nuclear reduction and nuclear elimination. Ironically, the policy of nuclear deterrence has prevented the elimination of nuclear weapons. The entire basis for determining them to be illegal has been undermined by this military policy. In other words, nuclear weapons cannot be declared illegal because we have an entrenched policy which makes them legal ipso facto. According to the military doctrine, which is the basis for NATO expansion, a preemptive nuclear strike may be undertaken if there is a sufficient threat of a regional conflict spreading to a large-scale war. In the face of all this NATO expansion, Russia might feel the need to flex their nuclear muscles, if only to show NATO that, even with their aging arsenal and diminished army, they are still a major power. There is a big difference between conventional weapons and weapons of mass destruction. Conventional weapons are intended for use against military targets, but nuclear weapons are used against non-combatants. Nukes are designed to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians in a flash. That is why nuclear weapons are so evil. If we do not drastically reduce the number of stockpiled nuclear weapons, it is going to become easier and easier for terrorists to get their hands on them. That means more terrorist attacks like this one. There was some talk about both sides reducing their nuclear stockpiles to a core deterrent force of less than 500 missiles each, and declaring that there would be no nuclear counterstrike in the event of the use of conventional or chemical weapons, but talks fell through. It seems that America is unwilling to relinquish its position as the most powerful country in the world. The nuclear weapons disposal facility on Shadow Moses Island was built at the beginning of this century. It was made only to temporarily store the nuclear warheads.
Why? If they wanted to dispose of them, why wouldn't they just dismantle them right away?
They cannot do that. You see, when you dismantle a warhead, you still have nuclear materials that must be stored. At this point, all of the nuclear material storage facilities are way past capacity. But they could not stop dismantling weapons while at the same time pushing START 2.
So you're telling me that this base was built so they could temporarily avoid being in conflict with START 2?
Most people think that we live in a safer world now, but with all the dismantled nuclear weapons and waste around, the threat of nuclear terrorism has increased tremendously.
It's ironic, isn't it?
It is just like Baker said. We are facing increasing danger from stored nuclear materials. You see, there are 3 elements necessary in the manufacture of nuclear weapons: nuclear materials, nuclear engineers, and manufacturing technology. All 3 of them can easily be acquired by either legal or illegal means, if you have enough money, that is. Over 200 tons of plutonium and over 1,000 tons of high-grade uranium have been removed from nuclear weapons so far. And on top of that, nuclear reactors all over the world continue to produce and leak spent nuclear fuel. According to one estimate, as of the year 2005, America alone was storing over 50,000 tons of nuclear material. There is no room left in our nuclear material storage sites. That is why we need nuclear weapon disposal facilities. There was a time when we thought it was safe to seal nuclear waste in special containers and bury it in a layer of rock salt without much exposure to underground water. Even though we now know there are big problems with that, we still do not have an effective disposal solution. Most of the nuclear waste we produce is just shoved underground with no intention of ever processing it. It is like an ostrich with its head in the sand. No, there is only one effective use for nuclear waste: military applications. You see, After chemical reprocessing, they can separate plutonium from the nuclear waste. Nuclear weapons normally use military-grade plutonium-239 with a purity of 93 to 94%. It is made in special nuclear reactors designed for military applications. On the other hand, the plutonium in spent nuclear fuel only has a purity of about 60%. But that does not mean that spent nuclear fuel cannot be used for military applications. America has been successful in tests using weapons made from nuclear reactor-grade plutonium. That means that eventually, everyone will be able to make nuclear weapons from plutonium separated from spent nuclear fuel. Spent nuclear fuel can also be used to make depleted uranium bullets or shells. They are armor-piercing anti-tank rounds. Du is 2.5 times denser than steel and 50% denser than lead, so it makes it an extremely effective armor-piercing weapon. It can cut through tank armor like a hot knife through butter. Unfortunately, when a Du round explodes, it spreads a fine dust which, when absorbed into a body, supposedly causes terrible long-term health problems, including genetic damage. During the Gulf War, American as well as Iraqi soldiers were exposed to Du dust and suffered from radiation poisoning and other illnesses. The American government conducted research to discover whether exposure could lead to cancer or genetic damage, but the results were inconclusive. Some people think that this type of radioactive contamination is what is behind the Gulf War syndrome, but the government will not admit it. Any time fuel is burned in a nuclear reactor, it will always produce, as a waste product, some spent fuel mixed with highly toxic radioactive compounds. Spent nuclear fuel stays radioactive for 300 years. In other words, this material will remain lethal for the next 3 centuries. Naturally, nuclear weapons contain plutonium. Most of the radiation emitted by plutonium isotopes consists of alpha rays. The ionization effects are strong, but if they are kept in containers, there is no danger of exposure. But if plutonium enters the body through breathing or other contact, it is quickly absorbed into the bones and internal organs. After that, there is no way to remove it. Once that happens, the victim will be constantly exposed to it, and just 1/1,000,000th of a gram of plutonium can cause cancer. That is why a plutonium leak is such a serious danger. Make sure you do not use your gun anywhere near there. There is a process which involves mixing the nuclear waste with low-grade uranium to convert it into a mixed oxide fuel for burning in light water reactors, usually in the form of glass logs. But MOX contaminates a nuclear reactor more quickly than low-grade uranium. It is also highly toxic. It is economically unfeasible unless the price of uranium is more than 4 times what it currently is. Not only that, you cannot ignore the danger inherent in transporting the MOX from the processing factories to the nuclear reactors. An accident could lead to radioactive contamination, or the materials could be hijacked by terrorists. No, I do not think MOX could be called a viable solution to the problem of plutonium disposal. They are currently doing research to find ways to transform minor actinoids, such as americium and neptunium, which are highly toxic with long half-lives, into nuclear materials with short half-lives. It is called extinction processing, but it is not being used much due to all the technical and economical problems with it. A serious program for nuclear waste treatment has yet to be established. The signing of START was a step in the right direction, but it created a flood of dismantled plutonium. Disposing of that plutonium safely is now the biggest challenge facing the world. Combustion in nuclear reactors, vitrification processing, lots of suggestions have been made, but in reality, no effective solutions have been found. As long as the strategy of nuclear deterrence continues, nuclear weapons may be reduced, but they will never be eliminated. If you think about it, nuclear reduction does not mean much without elimination as the ultimate goal. I used to work in the DIA. I figured the only way to achieve nuclear elimination was to work from the inside to convince them of the ineffectiveness of the deterrence theory.
Seems like you're pretty focused on that issue.
Victims of nuclear radiation are a sad thing to see. and I have seen a lot of it. I have seen more than enough of it. I was born and raised in Pripyat, Ukraine. I was 10 years old on that day, April 26, 1986.
You don't mean...
Yes, Chernobyl. That is the day that changed my life and thousands of other lives. I live just 3 kilometers north of there. 600,000 to 700,000 people were evacuated. Over 650,000 children suffered the effects of radiation poisoning. Between 1986 and 1993, 12,000 children died. My parents, and many others like them who helped in the cleanup, died a few years later from radiation sickness. We must rid this world of all nuclear weapons before they cause more misery, before they destroy the delicate environment that keeps us alive. I will not allow this pain and anxiety to pass on to yet another generation.